Welcome to the Nerds and Friends podcast. Today, me and my co-host Will Shaw are very happy to have the awesome Alexander Chard here joining us. Actor, writer, producer. Thank you so much for your time coming on, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of, jump into all the cool projects you've worked on. I've had the pleasure of reading some of your screenplays. They are fantastic. Um,
Thank you.
I think as much as I love Westerns and I loved X, I think my favorite has to be Fire on Over the Hill. That was a great
Thank you so
screenplay.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But as a nerd and a huge Star Wars nerd, I love the spec script you have written for Enfys Nest, for a pilot centered for the pilot of a series centered
Mhm.
around that awesome character, because I thought she was one of the standouts from the Solo movie. So I'd
Mhm.
love to talk all about that and hear kind of what your process was going into doing a spec screenplay,
For
in
sure.
such a big universe. Let's hear about it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and just to also say you were one of the first people that I sent one of the earliest drafts to.
Oh, thank you.
Um, just knowing that you were a big Star Wars fan, knowing that you had read some of my work, yeah, you felt like sort of one of the people I could trust to give me some good and honest feedback right away. So I
Oh,
just wanted to mention how grateful I am for that just right off the bat.
thank you.
Um, but yeah, the journey to that script kind of is there's sort of a few different elements to it. I went into when the Solo movie was announced, I was probably the biggest cynic about that movie coming out. I
Hmm.
was just that typical. Well, I was the type of Star Wars fan that was like Han Solo and Harrison Ford. That's untouchable. You can't do that. You can't go
Right.
there. How dare you do that?
Hmm.
And then obviously, you know, there, you know, then there had been the issues with directors dropping out and Ron Howard stepping in,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh god, this is going to be a mess. And then, um, yeah, and then sort of Last Jedi came out, and that was obviously a little divisive,
Yep.
and
Just a smidge.
just a smidge, yeah. That's a whole podcast on
Yeah.
itself. Um, and there was obviously a sense of, I think, fatigue, which reflected in the box office of Solo coming out. So
Hmm.
look, I went into it a huge cynic, purely just because of my attachment to the character and Harrison Ford's performance, and was like really, 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 really surprised when
Yeah.
I came out. I loved the film. I loved the tone. And Enfys Nest, I thought, was a super compelling character. I think Erin Kellyman, who plays her, is just captivating on screen when she takes off the mask. I think the kind of twist of that character, sort of starting off as the antagonist of that film, and then the twist at the end, the reveal that she's sort of part of the humble beginnings of the rebellion and has this sort of like
I
ragtag
got I
group
got
of,
goosebumps from that. I'm like, yeah, like she's part of that like the
yeah.
seeds of the rebellion just starting out. It's so
Hmm.
E-
cool.
Exactly. And the thing I think that I
Yeah.
really liked about it was that, like, it felt like her and the Cloud Riders felt kind of scrappy. Like they're such a diverse kind of
Hmm.
group, and it just felt to me that, and with that sort of speech she gives at the end of Solo about her village being kind of like, or like a village being destroyed, and then that sort of trauma and how that sort of spurred her on to kind of um, fight for oppressed people. That really struck a chord for me. So I kind of like came out of that film and I was like, man, I love that character. Every time I've rewatched the film, I'm like,
Hmm.
Enfys Nest, I need to write something with that character. So that seed was sort of planted pretty quickly. And then the way that I got to it was, as you know, Josh, I predominantly write feature films. I hadn't written a pilot, and I was sitting on a couple of ideas, but I guess the only thing that was holding me back from diving into it was my own sort of fears about being like, oh, I'm going to write a pilot. That's kind of scary for whatever reason. It's probably not even rational fear. But then the way that I thought about it was like, okay, if I'm going to write a pilot for the first time, a way to kind of learn about, to make it super low stakes and to make it something enjoyable as a means of learning how to write a pilot, I was like, I'm going to jump into a sandbox I love. What's that? Star Wars. And then I was like, what stories could I tell? And I was like, Enfys Nest, that's going to work as a cool pilot, especially with all these new Star Wars series coming out. I was like, yes, this is going to be a great way to kind of focus and really dive into that character. Yeah, and that's sort of where it started. That was all I needed, and I kind of just started planning it out. The story came to me pretty quickly, and for me, it was the challenge was I wanted to write in a universe that I was familiar with, but I wanted to bring in my own voice and themes that I particularly like exploring in my own work, which tend to sort of focus on loss and displacement, and generally the way that I like to explain sort of the characters I like to write about, they're lost souls that are untethered and are looking for something to anchor them. And so when I looked into the kind of backstory of Enfys Nest and some of the canon stuff that was already out there, it was like there were immediately trigger points of like she lost her mother when she was 16. And I was like, great, that's the hook I need. And I was off.
Well, I really like in your screenplay how you do play with her kind of difficult relationship with what seems like her anchor is this duty to be helping out with her station within the Cloud Riders, and then her urge to help people, but then also like she's drawn to help her missing sister, so she feels very torn of, okay, I only have a finite amount of myself to give. How do I fulfill this sense of duty? Because it does seem like that anchors her in this crazy, fractured world that she finds herself in. So I thought that was a
Yeah.
really compelling, like, dive into the character where I'm like, okay, it's the character I know from the Solo movie, but I'm seeing a whole new facet of her that just feels so natural to the character. Like, what were some of the ways you kind of explored that or came up with that?
Well, like I was saying, the hook for me was learning that existing in the canon was that her mother died at 16. As
Yeah.
far as I could find out, there were no I couldn't pinpoint what the actual backstory of that was. So I was like, that's all I need. Like I don't need
Yeah.
to explain. And then I started develop like exploring the idea of what if what if she inherited the mask? Like, and that for her it's this weight that perhaps deep down she feels undeserving of carrying. And so it was then playing with this dynamic of like having this sort of golden child older sister. I'm the youngest in my family, so
Yeah.
maybe I can kind of relate to this. But like, although I could argue that in my family, maybe I'm the golden child, but that's another thing. But like, but I liked the idea of setting up that the mask was going to be sort of passed down, or that it's been passed down throughout generations of these sort of warriors.
Yeah.
Um, and I thought there could be a great internal sort of tension if she feels that circumstance made her the bearer of the or the carrier of the mask, that she feels that it wasn't meant for her and that she's undeserving of that. So that, like, for me was like, okay, this is a cool little additional bit of tension, internal tension that I can play with that constantly kind of permeates through the story. And when people have asked me like, oh, okay, if this pilot got made and it was across the arc of a series, like what would that look like? And that's one of the major kind of points of the journey, is like her coming into sort of a sense of purpose and ownership as Enfys Nest, the leader of the Cloud Riders. Because where we start this story, yeah, like you said, Josh, she's torn. She's torn by this sense of like looking for her sister, who we learn was taken by the Jedi, which is also a huge point of contention for Enfys Nest,
Yeah.
is that in her eyes, the Jedi stole her sister, stole the person who was meant to inherit the mask. And so, it's motivated by like finding family, finding the rightful owner of this mask, like, and kind of like living in that bubble.
I'm curious, how do you feel about the Jedi? Because I've loved hearing people's different perspective on like the Jedi as a whole. Because like when you look at some of the stuff the Jedi Council does, it's like, oh, it's actually kind of questionable if you think about it. So I
Yeah,
like that you went there in your screenplay. I was like, yes, he gets it.
yeah.
Like,
I think like I think that hasn't been shown enough yet on any of the sort of Disney shows or series. Like I feel like amongst the fan base, it's talked about more. But for me, that was like that's always been an interesting angle. Is like the Jedi sort of hubris and almost arrogance in their ways. You know, if we're going to deep dive into that, like, you know, you could argue that their sort of dogmatic ways were the reasons why Anakin turned. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
he couldn't have love in his life. He couldn't have attachment. And it's like, well, maybe if he had those things, he could have also been a great Jedi. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And like, you know, and then you've got sort of, well, like Jedi's like Ahsoka, where it's like, you know, they toe that line of the gray. And I love that.
Yeah.
And I love that from a Jedi point of view. But I was like, what if the people in this sort of like post Jedi world are not necessarily kind of attached to the propaganda of the Empire that they were evil, but like have a direct link of, oh, one of my family members was taken to be a Jedi. Sure, that's a noble thing, but it fractured and tore our family apart. So like that
That's
was
a
like
really compelling angle. I like that.
yeah. So it was like I want to kind of, because for me with writing this as well, it was like, and with anything I write, like I like stories with scope that are sort of big in the worlds that they inhabit, but I love the intimacy of like zooming in on a character and their emotional kind of journey. And for me, it was like, yeah, that just seemed like an interesting kind of angle that maybe hadn't been explored. Of like, what if a family or a family member, you know, despised the Jedi because of what they did to their family, even if like part of that family, like in the case of in my spec, when we flash back to Enfys and her mother, like for the mother, it's a huge source of pride that her oldest child has been is force sensitive and is going to be trained to be a Jedi. Whereas for Enfys, that was the beginning of like the fracturing of their family, which like led to, you know, potentially her mother's death. Who knows? I'll have to write that episode.
Yeah.
Well, I gotta ask, because it's when you are writing for like a spec script, you definitely, I understand you want to make sure that you want to can make it something that only you can write, so that there's value in hiring you. But when you are dealing with a property like that, it has its own like tones and its own like theming. When you are dealing with like Star Wars or anything, how difficult is it to kind of bridge that gap between making something that's yours and something that's Star Wars?
Sure. So I guess one of the thing that I didn't say before, but one of my main intentions in writing this script was not to write it to be like, oh, this is something I want to make or that I hope will get made. But initially the intention was, yeah, to practice writing a pilot, but then also to have a sample within the Star Wars universe, so that down the line, if I sign with a literary manager, that can be something that can be pitched to them, not to make, but as an example of like, oh, Alex can write in this world, like, you know, let's bring him in on a show or whatever, like get into a writer's room. Like that would be the dream. But then the response I've got over this is like, oh, maybe this story itself has legs. So then to kind of rewind back to your question is, as a Star Wars fan and someone that's very passionate about the IP as a whole, the slipping into the tone part of it was the bit that I felt most confident about. Like that was the bit I felt most confident about. It was then kind of, yeah, and then it was the balancing act of like, okay, how do I slip in kind of themes that I want to explore? How do I slip in my voice? And initially, in some of the initial feedback, some of the response was like, oh, this leans a little dark for Star Wars. Like there should be some moments of levity or a character that offers a bit of relief. And so I've slightly tilted it that way. But then I've like Andor just came out and I've watched that. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yes.
Dark can exist and like heavier, sort of more adult tones can exist.
Yeah.
So that makes me feel more comfortable where I'm setting it. So it's like, yeah, the nailing the tone part was the bit I was most comfortable about, just through familiarity and loving Star Wars, everything Star Wars. So yeah, it was a bit of a balancing act, but I just constantly trusted, you know, as I would write and then read it back, just being like, would I watch this? I think that was the question that I would ask myself, especially as I was like rewriting drafts. Is like, would I watch this? Does this fit? Like, does it have this feel? Um, and I think as I was writing it too, it was really important to, especially with like the pacing and breaking between each scene, was just like constantly visualizing it as a Star Wars kind of, how would it look as a Star Wars kind of production.
Yeah.
So that kind of helped.
Well, speaking of balancing acts, I love that you had a Wookiee character who I got to play, and it was the coolest thing ever. You mentioned that, and I thought you delivered really well on, in the way I read the screenplay, I envisioned it where the Wookiee would not have subtitles, as is tradition in most Star Wars stuff. So but you still conveyed what the Wookiee was saying all the time through the dialogue of the other characters around him, and I thought that was brilliant. Like, how did that process start out? Like, and then how did you get to where you were, kind of plotting what he was saying and stuff?
So the only reason why I wrote it down, the Wookiee dialogue in English, was to just consciously in my head know what he was saying, to know how the characters around him replied. And like, and then it was important when we did the table read, which we were in, where you were like, you asked me beforehand, like, should I do the roars? And I was like, 100% do the roars, which you did amazingly, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Because then that was equally important for me to hear that, to know that the dialogue off the back of that was working as well. So it was just a process of like, putting in the English. Would I, if we went into production, would I want it subtitled? I mean, it would be interesting. Like you said, it's never been done before. But from what I got from that table read, was clarity of like where I had to either just refine the dialogue that followed from other characters, just to be clear about what my Wookiee, who's called Shartooth, was saying. That was awesome, man. Like when we did that table read,
that was so much
it
fun.
was just like, your
man.
first one, you kind of eased into it, and then you just grew in confidence, and they just got better and better. And
what's the language? Sweerook?
Shriwook.
One of those.
Which was just amazing, and you had the really funny Rip Riley playing your
great actor.
Playing your buddy, who was playing a Ugnaught called Glav.
Yeah, that was fun.
Like those two kind of sort of going back to what I was talking about before, about people being like, in the first couple of reads, I got being like, well, this is very dark. Add some of that levity. Like those two characters represent that kind of like little bit of light relief. Like the stakes are still very high in the story, but it's just a kind of fun dynamic of, it's like a big and a small. It's just like, it's always going to work, I hope.
Yeah.
Which actually, to my knowledge, not just the Wookiees, but also like R2-D2 in the actual Star Wars production has lines, and then they just remove in the actual movie, they remove the lines and just have the whatever sound effect there. And so it kind of goes on brand there, I would think, to actually write out every line there.
Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. And I mean, that would help the actors. It would help like whoever's directing, like just to know, like, and then probably like the sound people as well, to like get the tone of like what they're saying. So
but I think it's a cool staple of it. Shows, and that's one of the things I love about Star Wars and what captivated me with it since I was a kid, is that it's such a big universe, and I love that there's so many languages and cultures, and everyone's just kind of like, this is the norm out here, like it's great. And so with having these characters speaking other languages, and some characters understand it and some don't, but then the way other people reply, everyone's like, all right, like we get what's going on. So I think your screenplay achieves that, and I like that in other Star Wars stuff, and that's kind of where I like that we're getting finally with Andor, like more, because again, with Star Wars, there's so much room for different genres and tones
Yeah.
because it's such a big world that like that's why I love Andor. Like I love the Mandalorian, it's fantastic,
Mhm.
but I also love
Mm.
that Andor's there to be kind of like, here's the Mandalorian, here's Andor, like strap in, like this is cool, you know. So
Absolutely. You know, and it's like a thing. You know, I always like think it's funny when people get so upset about, like, Star Wars fans get so upset about a certain movie or whatever, and they're like, "Oh, this ruined blah blah blah," and it's like, this is a huge universe.
yeah,
Like, there can be many shades within that universe
yeah,
of tone and style, and we should, as fans, embrace that. Like, you
yeah,
can find what style or tone suits you, and you don't have to worry about the other stuff. Like me personally,
Mhm.
I will devour everything Star Wars, but
yeah,
like, you know, there's something for everyone, and yeah, and Andor, like you said, is it's really great that Disney and Lucasfilm are taking that kind of step of being like, oh yeah, let's explore these sort of different shades. Because, you know, like what it reminds me of is the expanded universe books, or legends
Yeah.
as they are now.
yeah,
Like, the thing that I loved about those growing up reading them was like, yeah, there was like all these different tones and styles and all these new different characters, and it was like
Mhm.
you could just dive into those and get lost and find stories or side characters that appealed to my sort of senses and tastes, and
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's kind of something that both with the prequel and sequel trilogies that kind of got lost a little bit, is like this is supposed to be like a big expansive universe, and in both episodes 1, 2, and 3 and 7, 8, 9, you kind of lost that feeling. Like
mm-hmm.
4, 5, and 6, you feel like you're just looking at this small part of this huge universe, and you definitely got that with a lot of the legend stuff and like the Clone Wars and Star
Yeah,
Wars Rebels series. But then, like in the prequel and sequel trilogies, it just feels small. The stories that they're trying to tell and going in a different direction. I mean, just completely get rid of the Jedi and Sith, in my opinion, and just tell us something else in there, which is, I think, The Mandalorian did better than anything else. That's kind of something that I'm looking forward to with a lot of new Star Wars content, like Andor and
yeah,
some of the other stuff that they've already Disney has decided that they're going to be rolling out with.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'm only I'm about to start episode 4 of Andor. I was a bit
nice.
behind, but like what I've loved so far is, or certainly in those first two going into 3, is like you barely hear anything about the Empire, or you don't even see like
Yeah, we haven't seen a
stormtroopers and
stormtrooper
tanks.
yet.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's like I love that, but I love the sort of lingering tension of knowing that the Empire's there in the background. Like,
yeah,
Mhm.
there's that presence. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's cool. I agree with you, Will. There's like so much more to expand on, and that it should move away from the kind of
Mhm.
Jedi and the Sith sort of stories. I think that's exciting to kind of dive in deeper to what else there is, and it's the possibilities are endless. It's huge. Like, and that was so much fun writing this pilot as well, was thinking up planets and being like, I'm going to go through like the sort of planet guides, and then just be like, yeah, I'm just going to make one up.
yeah.
It's like so much fun. It was so much fun doing stuff like that.
And dude, I love the city you created where there's that big reveal of what the city actually is.
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
like, oh, it's so cool. Like, I love that. So,
And I think that's
yeah.
kind of that's something that we've kind of been missing with Star Wars in the last, like, ever since Disney uncanified the legends, is that like there should be just a ton of weird stuff that we've never even heard of, or these
Hmm.
places that we've never been to or nobody knows about, because it's a giant, you're dealing with an entire galaxy.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so
That's it. It's like we still kind of get a lot of the same handful of places and planets all the time.
I do have a little bit of Tatooine fatigue, I must admit. Just a little bit.
Yeah, and that was kind of the disappointing thing with Kenobi is like, oh, we're back on Tatooine and we're going to Coruscant and we're doing this. That, oh, hey, look at this from the original movies. You remember that?
I gotta disagree with you though, Will. I loved Kenobi. I thought it was
Yeah, me too.
phenomenal. Yeah, I liked it a lot.
Mm.
I enjoyed it
Like
thoroughly.
with that, in the context of Kenobi, knowing where he went to and where he ends up, like that I can kind of give a pass to, where it's like,
Yeah.
oh well, I know he's going to be on Tatooine.
Yeah.
Where's he going to
Well,
go to?
we've talked about this with, we have a lot of authors who come on our podcast primarily for like novels, but like we've talked a little bit about how hard it is to write within the context of a prequel, or like when you know where the character ends up, you have to work so much harder to have meaningful stakes for that character's story. So I
Yeah.
feel like with Star Wars, that's the one interesting thing where like we know these benchmarks of like big events in the universe. So like with characters and their journeys before and after those big events, that can be really challenging as a writer, you know? So I
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, like and I guess spoiler alert if anyone hasn't watched Kenobi, but like,
yeah.
um, you know, in that first episode, because he confronts Vader in the very first episode, right? Or episode 2. Like it's really early, that first confrontation on
Yeah,
Tatooine.
it's a couple of. I thought it's episode 2 or 3. I don't.
That's on the kind of smaller village, and then in the quarry they have the duel,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, with
Yeah,
the fire and he burns it.
very, yeah, episode 2 or 3 probably.
Yeah, and I remember thinking at the time, like, "Whoa, that confrontation comes really soon." Like, obviously, it looks cool, and then thinking, "Does this take away from the confrontation in A New Hope, like that final confrontation?" But then the way that story arc kind of unfolded, it just made it. By the end of it, I was like, "Oh man, this makes." They've tied it in so well that it makes all those beats from the originals feel even like they have more weight to them now, and
Yeah.
like feel way connected. It was really clever.
Yeah,
because that would have been so difficult.
right. Well, that's I feel like
so
what they
easy to get
achieved
wrong.
with Rogue One so well too is because kind of like we were saying with Han Solo. Like when Han Solo was first announced, I was like, we don't need a young Han Solo movie. Like we know the character, like leave it vague. But then I was really blown away by the movie. I thought it was phenomenal. And so with Rogue One, also, I was like, hey, that's cool. Like we've always known the Death Star plans were stolen, but like, do I really need to see how it happened? And then when I watched the movie, I was like, this is phenomenal. Like it added
Yeah.
so much gravitas to the beginning of episode 4. And I love how
Yeah.
it just takes place right before. And I was like, oh, that's
Yeah.
perfect. And so, yeah, I love
And I
Rogue One
think
too.
Rogue One is a really interesting thing because, like, with the whole plot, like, we know kind of how it ends for
Yeah.
the greater story, but this is a story within the story that just hadn't been told, and they could have done anything with that movie as long as we get to the beginning of episode 4. And none of those characters had anything to do with the later plot, like in like a greater sense. And the way that the Star Wars movies are spaced out, with the script at the beginning just kind of basically telling you what happened, anything that happens after episode 4 could be written off. And so there was just a lot of freedom with that, I feel, to tell an interesting story and to have a different tone. And I really wish that, well, Disney would do more with that, but I think that having Rogue One and then I almost said Obi-Wan, Kenobi and Solo come out are kind of, they are opening that door to having some of these different stories in the larger universe.
Yeah. And it's like, yeah, and it's an interesting kind of, as much as I would be like, oh, I want Star Wars stories that are set in a completely different time. It's still nice kind of filling those little gaps along the timeline that we're familiar with and seeing what they do with it. It's really cool.
Yeah,
It's
I
been
agree
really
completely.
clever. Yeah, I really enjoyed Obi-Wan. Andor, but Andor so far is just like,
yes,
unlike anything I've seen.
Yeah,
In the
it's
Star Wars production.
very unique for a live action Star Wars story to explore it. I think it's been just the
Yeah.
whole time I watched the first 4 episodes, I was like, based on the trailers, I was like, I wonder if they're going to do this, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, they're actually doing it, and it's perfect. Like I love it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah,
And
I've
I
been loving
think
it.
Diego Luna,
Yeah,
Diego Luna. I
Mhm.
think his performance in this is like even better than Rogue One.
yeah, because I think he
Like
really
it's
like.
really
I, I
compelling.
I think for Rogue One, he kind of thought of all this cool backstory for his character, and then
Mm,
his character had kind of not pigeonhole, but kind of he had a framework within the plot of the movie that he had to function in.
Mhm.
Whereas with
yeah,
this one, this is like 5 years before, and it's like let's see who he is and like all the nuance of his character and how he got here. And
yeah, yeah.
it's been captivating to watch for sure. I love it.
Really has.
Yeah.
Really has.
Well,
It's
now,
awesome.
having seen having seen what Disney is doing with that, with Andor, seeing what they've done with Kenobi, what they did with Rogue One, how intimidating is that to try to approach that particular part of the universe to try to write a script in there? Because there's a lot of room there. There's a lot of expectation, I feel like, from audiences and from like huge Star Wars fans of what should be in there.
Mm. You know, if I was being paid by Lucasfilm to write something, I might feel that pressure a little bit differently. I would hope that it wouldn't affect me in a
Mhm.
negative way, but I would certainly feel that pressure to, yeah, I mean, I as much as I wouldn't want to, I definitely feel the pressure to like please fans and
Mhm.
give something that fans like. I mean, for me with this script, like obviously it was super low stakes. I was writing it for myself. I wasn't, so it was, you know, there was no like feelings of pressure. But I will say, like, the greatest joy I got from writing it was getting feedback from Star Wars fans like Josh and other people that I sent it to, who like, yeah, would comment on like little Easter eggs I dropped in there, or like little beats that I did, or like a character
Mhm.
choice or a line. Like that was the biggest thrill. So I can only imagine if I was ever like employed to write on a Star Wars show or to write a movie, which would be an absolute dream.
Mhm.
Um, you know, it's inevitable that with any sort of passionate fandom, there's going to be people that will be unhappy. Um, but you know, I would just hope that you know there would be enough voices that loved it, and that's all I would
Mhm.
really focus on. And feel no pressure right now, but if I got in that position, I will jump back on this podcast and be like, guys, help me out. This is insane.
But I,
Um,
I think, in a lot of the Star Wars projects that I've enjoyed the most, I think it's cool to look behind the scenes, and it seems like there's a lot of there's usually like multiple people involved. Like for Rogue One, it
Mhm.
jumps to mind where it was
mhm.
I think Gareth Edwards or Gareth
Yep.
Evans was the main
Gareth Edwards,
director.
yeah.
Yeah, and then Tony Gilroy came in and did a bunch of rewrites and really helped with the third act. And now he's show running Andor, which is exciting, but he was saying that he wasn't a huge Star Wars fan, but like he has so much storytelling experience. So when you kind of took his focus on just telling a good story, and then Gareth Edwards like Star Wars passion because he's like our age and is just like loves Star
Hmm.
Wars, and that's the same thing that happened on Solo with Lawrence Kasdan and John Kasdan.
Yeah.
Is like Lawrence Kasdan wrote Empire Strikes Back, but he said like, hey, I just wrote that to be a good movie, and then George Lucas added some Star Wars flavor, and I'm like, yeah, like you just named like my three favorite Star Wars movies, and it was all the same thing where it's this kind of like horse duo of two people where it's like
Yeah, yeah.
it's like you write a good story, you tell a good story, and then you layer in the richness of the Star Wars world and let your passion for it show through. And I think you've managed to achieve both with your spec script, where it's a solid story, great character exploration, great stakes. It's the
Mhm.
kind of pilot where I'm like, as a viewer, like, well, I need to know what happens next. Like, you can't stop there. But at the same time, it
Thanks,
has
man.
all the richness and Easter eggs and like fun, beats and adventure of a Star Wars thing. So I think that's what you want to achieve, and you did it. So it's awesome.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's like,
Mhm.
yeah, it's because, ultimately, if I want this to be
Mhm.
seen as a really strong sample for me to write in that universe, having it connect with Star Wars fans and having Star Wars fans being able to identify it as something that would fit within the kind of catalog of shows and
Mhm.
uh, content that they have now. yeah, that means a lot. It means, it sort of gives me encouragement that it's on the right track. And yeah, who knows, maybe one day I'll get in that door. But that's the dream.
That'd be
Yeah.
awesome, man. Well,
Yeah.
really quick, just to kind of wrap things up with one final question, but for everyone watching or listening, Alexander Chards, we'll put whatever links you'd like us to add in the description of the podcast, so
Sure.
people
Yeah.
can follow you on social media and
Yeah.
see stuff as it comes along. But I wanted to talk really quick about your other screenplays, because the ones I've read
Hmm.
are all phenomenal, and so just a lot of our listeners are aspiring writers. What's kind of some tips you'd give? I know you helped me immensely by telling me about Coverfly, and
Yeah.
my Lost Colony screenplay has gotten a lot of attention through that, so that's been amazing. And so, like, if
Yeah.
someone wants to be like a screenwriter, what's kind of the first step you tell them to start working on, or just kind of a tip for aspiring writers?
If you want to be a screenwriter, the first, I know this sounds very sounds very obvious, but you just have to write. You have to turn up every day and write. That was a struggle for me for a long time. Was having a discipline to do it and to finish things. But a friend of mine gave me the advice of doing 3 pages a day, because 3 pages, it's nothing. If you write more, that's great. If you write 3 pages and they're crappy, you've still written 3 pages, and you can always edit them later. Um, yeah, and always just show up. Once you kind of, what I learned was that once I got into that routine, like that mindset, 3 pages a day, and initially had it feel like it was developing a discipline, before I knew it, it shifted into a habit, and it became something that was not daunting. It's just something that it became like, it's like muscle memory. I can just kind of turn up now and I can show up. And um so as obvious as that sounds, just start writing and write as much as you can. Share it with people that you trust and that you're close with, that can give you um honest and thoughtful feedback that can help elevate your writing and help you better, help you get better. The screenwriting on community on Twitter is amazing.
Yeah.
Kind of just dive into that. You'll, you just have to type in like hashtag screenwriting and people's posts will come up. Just start adding people. And that I found is like, for me personally, screenwriting Twitter has been an example of the good social media can do. It's such a generous community. I've made some really great friends, connected with a lot of people who I trust, who I send my work to, who give me great feedback. And when I say great feedback, I mean like constructive feedback that can help me pick out holes in my stories, help me elevate my stories, help me develop characters, all that good stuff. So yeah, write, surround yourself with good people that will help you improve, and be brave to write and be brave to share. And it's a grind, but it can be really fun. And it can be really fulfilling. But yeah, do it by building community around you, I think.
That is really
Be
good
my advice.
advice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Alex, thank you so much for being on Nerds and Friends, man. This has been an awesome time.
Josh, Will, it's been an absolute pleasure. I could sit and talk about Star Wars all day long. So
Me
it's
too.
very
This
easy
has
being
been
here.
fantastic.